Thanks for having me. It's my first time in Brazil, so it's nice to be here. I'll try to go slow to allow the translators to keep up. FX is here. I understand that he had some things to say about me yesterday. So I have like 10 slides all about FX today. Just kidding. I know. A lot of what got me to think about this talk was there's this conference in the United States called DEF CON that is like a hacker conference, and it's very common to hear people go to this conference and talk about how they turn their phone off, or they bring a burner phone just for the conference and then they throw it away or something ridiculous, right? So at least it seems ridiculous to me. And so this talk is sort of about that and what you need to really worry about with mobile security, and should you worry at all, or how much you should worry, and sort of just try, from my opinion, to get the facts out about like the real problems with mobile as opposed to what most people sort of think. All right, so here's some stuff about me. I can talk more about that in a little bit. So here are, like, if you just Google mobile security, you'll find tons of articles about the threat of mobile security. So here's just some that I just grabbed off the internet. So it says things like smartphone cyber attacks to grow this year. This is meaning the year of 2013. And so these I all grabbed basically from December of 2012. So they're talking about this year, and you can already start to see that nothing really happened this year. So you can already see that they were sort of full of shit. So here's one that actually got real recently. Mobile devices, the new front in threat war. Growing threat. So this one specifically calls out Android and says it's a malware magnet. So how you can protect yourself from mobile threats. So top of the list. So there's basically you never see an article that says there is no mobile threat. They always talk about how huge the mobile threat is. And this one was very important to me because if you can't watch porn on your phone, what is the point of having a smartphone? So there's a lot of headlines out there, and reporters, they like you to read what they have to say, and I just want to see what I want to talk about what is reality, at least from my perspective. So just to show that I don't really hate all flashy news stories. Like I think news stories are okay even if they're a little flashy. So here's some more. So this one's about like the iPhone being exploited. This one's about Android. This one's about like SMS attacks. This is that hacking contest, fun to own. And then this one is about like near field communication. So does anyone know what these all have in common? Yeah, so these are all about me. So all attacks I've done. And so like I like reporters as much as anybody, maybe more. But that doesn't necessarily mean just because I hack the iPhone that you need to worry about your iPhone, right? So that's the difference. That's what I want to talk about is just because you see that there's a theoretical attack doesn't necessarily mean it's something that you have to actually worry about. All right, so what am I going to talk about? So first I'm going to talk about, it's very basic level, sort of what kinds of attacks there are. And then I'm going to talk about like why those attacks are different when you are talking about a mobile platform versus like your computer. And to do that, I'll give a little background on Android and iOS and how they are designed. And then I'll talk about actual problems that I think exist for mobile. And then I'll talk about sort of how attackers see it. And then finally, so today I say mobile isn't too big a threat, but maybe 2 years from now that won't be the case. And so I sort of talk about why things might change. Okay, so at the most very basic level, you guys all probably understand this. I'm like, let's talk about how attacks happen at all. So there's basically two ways that a bad guy can get code on your device or your computer or your TV or whatever. So one is that you download it and run it, malware, right? And the other is that there's some exploit involved. So this is, you're just sort of using the device like it's supposed to be used, but there's some vulnerability that allows an attacker to get code running on your device. So talk about each of those a little more. So in the case of malware, so you're downloading code and running it, and maybe you think it does something that it doesn't, or you're somehow kind of tricked into running it. But the bottom line is, from the device's perspective, the user wants to run the code. So it's computers aren't designed to help you there. The computers are designed to run code that you want it to run. So traditionally, the way that we deal with this problem is something like antivirus, whose job is supposed to be able to tell the good code from the bad code and only let you run the good code. And whether it works or not is a different story, but that's what it's designed to do. On the other hand, exploits again are something where you're not trying to run code necessarily. You're just trying to view a web page or read your email or whatever. But because there's some problem with the software, you are exposed to letting the bad guy change what your program's doing to do whatever they want to do. And a lot of what happens at the end of that is the code will download some sort of software to run that the attacker wanted to do. So let's talk about how you can what you can do to stop both of those things. So basically, there's a few things. If you want to stop malware from showing up on your phone or computer or refrigerator or whatever, there's like a few basic things you could try, a few tactics. So you can make it hard to get it on in the first place. You can limit what it can do once it's there. You can limit how long it can be there. So if you had malware on your computer, but after 5 minutes it stopped working, that would be bad, but not too bad. And then finally, you can watch it and try to detect when it does something that you think is bad. On the exploitation side, you can try to make your software that you're using not have vulnerabilities or have fewer. You can make it hard when there is a vulnerability to actually exploit it, and this is basically what the industry has spent a lot of time doing lately. They've sort of given up on finding all the bugs, and then they focus more on making it hard to actually do the exploit. Then you can limit what the compromised software can do, and so this is the ideas of sandboxing and so forth. You can make it hard to persist. So this is the idea, we'll talk about this later, but on the iPhone, unless you have chained together multiple things, typically if you restarted your iPhone, the payload would go away. So and then we'll talk more about the persistence even in the Android case. But anyway, so you can make it to where it's hard to stick around forever. And then finally, you can try to detect things. If your phone starts calling out to China, you can alert the user or something. So then if you want to, you can really read that, but it's the same things I just listed, except I talk about the things that you as a user can actually do versus what Apple or Google or something can do. So you'll notice that basically you can't do anything. The only thing you can really try to do is detect problems. So you're not going to be able to make mobile Safari have fewer bugs, and you're not going to be able to make it harder to exploit in Android. These are all things that the device manufacturer can do, but you can't as a user. So it just goes to show that there's not much you can really do except I guess pressure your vendors into doing better. So let's shift and start talking about, so that everything I just said is true for computers or mobile devices or whatever. So let's talk about why mobile devices are actually different than computers when it comes to malware exploitation or anything like that. So did they even, does anyone know what Raiders of the Lost Ark even is? Is that the Brazilian thing that you guys have seen? It's like 2 people. So anyway, it's this movie from the 80s that has Harrison Ford. It's pretty good. He travels around the world as an archaeologist, I don't know, collecting things. I don't know what it's really about, but in the end, he's like pretty cool. So anyway, so back in you know, when computers were sort of coming into existence and people were starting to get them, there really was no security like thought about. It was like these are devices that you want to program and run code and you know, when you could download something, when it was like when you got something, you just ran it and that was it. And there wasn't even really antivirus, and there definitely wasn't like, you know, memory randomization or anything like that. It was just, they were very simple and that was it. But if you move forward to, you know, more recent times, and so I call out specifically 2008 for a reason I'll talk about in a minute. Things had changed a lot, right? So we at least had an idea of what we wanted from security. We weren't like super good at it, but we at least knew where we wanted to go. So we had things like, you know, security built into the software development lifecycle. We had antivirus, of course, by then. That was working, you know, the salespeople will tell you it works very well. You know, we'll tell them it's okay. And then exploitation had really moved on to a point where you didn't see a lot of exploits in things like, you know, you know, maybe 3 years before this, like all the exploits you would hear about or talk about would be like in, you know, the web browser itself, say. But those had gotten significantly harder recently in this time period to do that. And so a lot of the exploits that you were seeing at this point were in like third-party plugins like Java or Flash or something like that. And then, while in 2008 not everything had like ASLR and depth and things like that, we at least knew what they were, and we were putting them in a lot of products. So we had exploit mitigations, even if they weren't perfect at that time. So that was, oh, and then the Indiana Jones movie that came out in 2008 was really stupid. So while security improved, movies were getting worse. I guess that's not the point. So why did I choose 2008? So 2008 is basically when, you know, what we call smartphones, you know, at least what I call a smartphone came out. So they had other phones that I guess you could argue were smart before then. But for me, it was when the iPhone 2 came out and then the Android phone both came up in 2008. So if you think about, you ask like, well, how come I'm not talking about iPhone 1? So I'm an old guy, but you guys might not have been around when iPhone 1 was out. But iPhone 1 was like a totally different creature than iPhone 2. So iPhone 1, like there was no app store, there was no SDK. It was just designed to be basically like a web browser, and which was cool back then. But you know, when people would bug Steve Jobs and say like, yeah, we really want to download apps and stuff, he was like, no. What you want to do is you want to write web pages that look exactly like apps, and then you can search for that web page. Well, after a year, I guess he decided that was kind of stupid, because it is. And so they changed, when iPhone 2 came out, that's when they included the App Store. And, oh, and I should say in iPhone 1 there was basically no security. So your web browser ran as root. There was no exploit mitigations. It was very, very easy to exploit. But in iPhone 2, Apple redesigned it to make it to where you know, you could download apps. And in order to do that and protect themselves, they added a bunch of stuff that was really to protect their app ecosystem, but as a side effect, made the device a lot more secure. So anyway, so this was in 2008 when phones came out, and you know, I claim that one of the reasons that smartphones are sort of inherently more secure than like your computer is because of the fact that when they were developed, like we had learned a lot more about security. We thought about security, you know, maybe not as a primary thing, but at least we knew about it, and so there was some design that went into it that made it better. So, like I said, so we at least knew that someone someday was going to try to write phone malware, and they sort of built that into it from the beginning. Both of these devices had some exploit mitigations built in from the beginning, and then they were already thinking down the road at adding more. So I think both of those devices I just said had Let me make an iPhone 2. I think they both had. Maybe they both had depth and not ASLR or something like that. But anyway, now they both have both, so it doesn't really matter. You can, for both of those devices, they weren't really ever intended to just download stuff from the internet and run them. So they were always developed in mind, even though it might be possible. It was developed in mind where you were supposed to go to a particular place, like an app store, and these apps are special in some way, and you can download them and run them. But you're not supposed to just be able to go to some random website and run them. And then every application has to run inside of some sort of sandbox. So they're already thinking about limiting things as well. So it's a totally different experience than your typical PC. The exploitation is harder in a lot of ways too. And again, some of these are maybe accidental or companies sort of arguing over turf wars or something that made it this way. But the end result is that it's harder. So the attack surface is smaller. You don't have Java running on your mobile browser. You don't have Flash and stuff like that. And so there's just less code that we know how to look for bugs and then write exploits in. So it's harder. We have ASLR and depth built into the phones now. And then since the apps run in a sandbox, you're going to need multiple exploits to get out of it. So you're going to need one to get the initial code execution running, and then you'll need another one to escape the sandbox. So while it's not, obviously since I've done it before, it's not impossible, it's just harder. So let's specifically talk about how iOS and Android are built, and then that will help us figure out why it's hard to do these things, and in particular we'll be able to compare sort of iOS and Android and why one might be harder or easier than the other. Anyway, so this quote I have here is sort of about the difference. It all sort of boils down to a difference in philosophy. So Apple is sort of very, very much wants to be in control of everything on your device, and sort of as a side effect, they get security from that. Where Google wants to have a very open device and use the community to sort of police themselves. And so one maybe isn't better or worse than the other. But it's just different in their design. You can see this. So the main difference between the two platforms is code signing. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, in iOS at least, everything, so all binaries, all libraries have to be signed by some trusted party, which out of the box, the only trusted party is Apple. You can add other trusted parties, like Enterprise, if you want. But out of the box, everything has to basically be signed by Apple. And then this extends even further than just the things that you load in, like binaries and libraries. Like it actually gets to the point where every page in memory has to be signed with a few caveats. But for the most part, every page has to be signed. And what this means is that in the end, you have the apps you download, they have to come from the App Store or some trusted place. And not only that, but when you download them, they can't do things that they weren't doing for everyone. So it's not like when I download something, it's going to behave one way, and when you download it, it's going to behave a different way. They can't change what they do on the fly. Like if you static analyze them, you'll see everything that they can do. They can't allocate pages, write code to it, and run them because of the whole code signing thing. So that means that if you could say exploit mobile Safari or some other program, and as an attacker you might want to download your tools or whatever to the device and run them. Well, because they're not signed, they won't be able to run. So you can't download your normal tool set to your phone or to iOS and expect it to work. And then likewise, you're not going to be able to, without doing some more work, survive reboot because you won't be able to have left any code around. Or if you left any code around and then you tried to actually run it when it booted back up, it wouldn't run because it's not signed. So it has a lot of consequences for attacking. And so at some point you can imagine chain together some sort of exploits, one that gets code running, then you can have maybe a second one that breaks out of the sandbox, and then maybe a third one to get you root. Even if you did all that work, you're still not going to be able to survive a reboot because none of your code is going to be signed. So you have to actually do more work than even that to survive. So you have to basically be able to turn off the code signing if you want to survive a reboot, which involves more than this. So you can see, like, that's a lot of work. So what about the app? So can you maybe, since exploitation sounds really hard, maybe we should focus as an attacker on malware, so like getting bad apps, people to run bad apps. So what sort of protections do apps get? Well, they have to run as user mobile. They run in a sandbox. For some things like contacts or photos, they have to ask the user permission. They have to be signed, of course, and they can't change themselves. So there's a lot of restrictions on what your app is going to be able to do. So even if you can get something into the App Store, it's going to be limited in the things it can do. And so getting things into the App Store is kind of a pain too. So you have to have an account in the App Store, and that's going to cost you like $100. And also they have this thing where you have to verify who you are. So you need a credit card, and then you also need, in some cases, if you can see this window, sometimes you need something else, and they're not really clear on what that is. Like maybe you have to like call them or something. I don't know, but the fact that they don't tell you exactly what you need to verify yourself is sort of scary if you're an attacker. And then once you have an account, you have to upload your app, the binary only, to Apple, and they get a chance to sort of run it and play with it and see if they think it's malicious. And then if it passes that, then it goes into the App Store. And so even if so suppose as a malware author, you get something into the App Store that's malware. Eventually someone's going to figure that out, and when they do, Apple will of course remove it from the App Store, and that's going to stop other people from downloading it, which is sort of, that's pretty different than what happens in the Windows world, so or other PC world. If I write some malware and I put it out on some random website and people start downloading it, probably it's going to be there forever, unless I have it at some popular website or something. And so no one knows this for sure, but most people think that Apple can actually remotely remove apps from your device. I don't think anyone really knows about that, but it's just another thing that, Apple basically works as an antivirus for your phone. So it looks at all the apps before you can run it, and then it can possibly remove them afterwards. So what real iOS malware is there? Well, there really is almost none. So there's been a handful of things that will maybe grab your contacts or something like that. There hasn't really been any real malware. So if you wanted to write malware that would grab your address book and send it up to some server, and you're okay with the user having to click OK, you could do that. If you wanted to do something more complicated than that, you would have to build an exploit into your app. But the problem with this is that, if you have an exploit for a new iOS device and you build it into an app, you have to give it to Apple to review before it ships. And unless you have just 5 or 6 exploits laying around, you probably don't want to do that because you don't want Apple to. They probably won't catch it, but if they do, I don't know. I don't like to hand exploits to vendors, so bad guys probably wouldn't either. So this is the story about me getting kicked out of the App Store. So this is what I had to do to do it, and it just shows it's a real pain as an attacker. So if you pretend I'm an attacker, which I'm not, I had to get an App Store account. So I did that. That was $100. Then I could make an app. But I wanted to make an app that could do something malicious, and so I had to find a vulnerability that allowed me to do that. So I found a vulnerability that allowed my program to download new code and run it that wasn't signed, which you shouldn't be able to do. So I found a vulnerability. So then I wrote an app that had that exploit for that vulnerability built into it. And I uploaded it to for review to Apple. And so that was scary, right? Because I'm giving Apple information about a vulnerability in their system that I don't really want them to know that exists or that I know that it exists. So I did that. It passed review. So that also tells you that maybe the review process isn't that good. So then I wrote code that it would download and run, unsigned code, and that worked. And then like if I was a bad guy, I guess at some point I could try to make money or something from that. I don't know. I'm not a bad guy. But then eventually they figured it out, and they removed it from the App Store, and they removed me from the. They took away my account. So I lost $99 from that, and I didn't get anything out of it, right? So as an attacker, I'm terrible. I'm a terrible attacker because I just lose money. So it just shows that like. If I wanted to do the same thing against, some desktop computer, it would have been a lot easier. I wouldn't have lost $99, and so it's harder. So if just contrasting the two, if I want to have you download my malware and run it, and you're running, say, Windows or something, not to pick on Windows because other systems have the same thing, but I have to get you to download my executable. You might have AV. I might have to bypass that. It's not that big a deal. And once I've done that, I'm there forever. Like I'm never going to go away. I can do whatever I want, and it's easy. For iOS, I have to get a dev account. Unless all I want is like your contacts or something, I'm going to have to build an exploit into it. I need to bypass the App Store review process, and then depending on if you're talking about exploitation or not, I might have to actually break the code signing in order to persist. Either way, it's obviously much harder to do it against iOS than against like Windows. So what about Android? Is Android hard too? So this is just a quote about how open societies are good. So Android has like pretty similar security. The biggest difference is again they don't have the code signing requirements. They have some code signing requirement, but it's not really. It's not meant. It's just meant for like record keeping. It's not meant for security. So they have some similar restrictions on their apps. They run in a sandbox. The difference is that in iOS, all the apps run in the same sandbox. If you include the whole like you have to approve certain things. Where in Android, all the requirements that the app's going to need are asked about up front, and the user has to agree or not. So, and also another huge difference because of the lack of code signing is that in Android, apps can download new code and run them at runtime, and that's okay. So you can imagine an app that is, totally innocent, doesn't do anything bad, all it does is download code and run it, and that code it downloads sometimes is good and sometimes is bad. That's totally different. You can't do that in iOS. Likewise, you can imagine code that maybe downloads an exploit and that exploits, that breaks you out of a sandbox or something in Android. And then you could actually change that to, as new versions of Android come out or something. What about getting apps into the Google Play Store? So again, there's a chance for Google to catch any of your malicious apps here, but it's actually much easier to get apps through this way. The main difference is it's cheaper, $25. You can also register somewhat anonymously. So here is in this picture, John Overhyde talks about how you get these like temporary credit cards and charge them up and like throw away phones that you usually need a phone number to register. But it's very easy to get more or less anonymous accounts on the Google Play Store. And then the way that they do the checking of the apps is totally automated. So they use a system called Bouncer to do that, where in Apple, they don't, it's just a mystery how they do it. So they actually do automated analysis at Apple as well, and people have talked about that. But there's also some mysterious, potential hand. What's that? Monkeys? Yeah. So yeah, they have humans involved, and so there's always a chance the human is going to actually be smart. but probably not. John O and I wrote a paper about how to bypass Bouncer. So it's pretty easy because it's an automated system, and you can sort of evaluate what it's doing and then behave differently if you know you're inside a Bouncer, or if you think you're on a real phone. So if they do ever catch you, though, they can remove your app from their store, and they can definitely remotely remove apps too. They've done it before. So you basically have two choices if you want to write Android malware. You can just hope the user is stupid and is going to let you do the things that you want to do, which is probably a pretty good bet that they'll do that. So here's like an app that asks for tons of stuff, tons of permissions that it probably doesn't need. If the user says yes, then you're done. As an attacker, you've won. The other way to do it, if you want to actually be tricky, is you don't ask for any permissions, but you have built in some sort of vulnerability that gets you root or something on the phone that then lets you do things that you didn't have permission to do. So that's obviously a lot harder. So if you want to do the same trick of getting malware onto Android devices, it's easier than iOS. All you have to do is bypass Bouncer, which is, again, pretty easy. Generate some throwaway accounts. Maybe write an exploit, or maybe just have the user, hope the user clicks yes. And then, so I have a PhD in math, and so I really hold myself to high standards when it comes to numbers and analysis. And so this is the chart I came up with. Very sophisticated analysis here. So how hard is it to write malware? Like this is my takeaway is it's pretty easy if you're just running against desktop. Android, it's harder. iOS, it's much harder. So it sort of proves the case when you look at how much malware there are. Again, these numbers are just sort of made up, but I'll give you some actual numbers in a second. You don't really see. I mean, attackers aren't totally stupid. They're going to do what they want to do for whatever reason they want to do it. But usually they're not going to choose something that's hard on purpose. Only guys like me do that because we don't really want to do anything except show off. So there's been much more instances of malware on Windows. There's been more on Android than iOS, and there's been almost none on iOS. So here's some actual numbers from that came out of McAfee. So this is how much mobile malware there was through the year. So as you can see, there was almost none until 2012, which is last year, and then you saw something like 40,000 pieces of malware or something, and then in 2013, around the same amount. And this is from an antivirus vendor, and so they always say way more than there really is. So this is like they would probably tell you there was this many in Windows in like an hour or something like that. So anyway, it's not that much if you compare it to something like Windows. And then if you look at what type of malware they're seeing, again, this is from McAfee. Almost all of it is Android. So iOS doesn't even get a mention in the pie chart. It's so small, it doesn't even get a pie slice. So most of the malware they see is Android, and maybe that's because that's all they're looking for or something, but probably this is pretty realistic. So that's malware. What about exploitation? So you don't see a lot of mobile exploits either, and there's reasons why. So this is a chart that shows how much people are using their computer's web browser versus using their mobile web browser. So the blue chart, or the blue line there, is their computer's web browser, and you can see like it's still, it started back in the chart starts in 2009, and back then it was like 100% is your computer, and by the end, and now it's down to like 85% or something. So still, 85% of traffic is going to not be from mobile. Only like 15% is going to be from a mobile browser. And so if you go through the trouble of writing a mobile exploit, the odds are like the people visiting your website are not going to be on a mobile device, and so you're not going to be able to exploit them. So it makes sense if you're a bad guy and you see this, Like, why am I going to write a mobile exploit? I'm going to write a exploit for a web browser on a PC. Another thing is that in real life, most things that are exploited are plugins. And so here's a graph of some CVs that came out and what percentage of browsers have that plugin. And you can see that most of the things that are being exploited are things like Flash and Java and .NET and stuff like that. Well, none of these things are even on a mobile platform. So it eliminates tons of the vulnerabilities that we see in real life. Another thing is that it's hard, if I want to exploit your web browser, it's hard for me to get you to come to my website. Like, why would you come to my website? And so one of the tricks that bad guys do is they pay for advertisements on websites you would really go to. And then they build the exploit into the advertisement. But it turns out that it's hard to get advertisements to show up on mobile devices. That's why, like, every time you visit a web page on your computer, there's like ads all over the place. But on your mobile browser, you'll notice there's usually not any sort of ads like that, sometimes. And this is reflected in this chart that shows how much cheaper it is to get advertisements on mobile devices, which sort of shows that it's hard to get these mobile devices to actually show your ads. So it's cheaper to the advertisers because no one sees advertisements in mobile browsers. So that's another thing you can't do as an attacker. But exploits do exist, right? So one of the only mobile exploits that has ever really been made public is jailbreak me.com 3, which came out in 2011 by Comics. So basically, let me tell you how that worked, and then you can see like why it was hard. In fact, I had said, like an idiot, about a year before that we would never see an exploit. But I was wrong. So take that in mind when everything I say today. So anyway, the way it worked was there was a bug in the font parser that was used in the web browser. And the important thing about it was not only allowed you to overwrite a buffer, it allowed you to read a buffer as well. So it was a memory leak and memory corruption all in one bug. So normally you would probably have to find 2 bugs to do that. And then, so once he was able to figure out where he was and corrupt memory, then he did return-oriented programming inside the program because of the depth. Then he had code running in the web browser. But that's not enough. So then he knew another vulnerability in the kernel that he exploited from within the return-oriented programming payload to turn off code signing. Once he turned off code signing, he downloaded a bunch of stuff and ran it. And so this was not an exploit in the sense of, it was bad. Like, people visited the site on purpose. I visited that site. It was to jailbreak your phone. But obviously, if it can jailbreak your phone, it can do anything. So this could have been bad, but it wasn't. But it shows you how hard it was to do this. So it required, in this case, 2 vulnerabilities. Usually it would require 3 vulnerabilities. And it required writing an exploit inside of another exploit. It's very difficult. So just to sort of wrap that up, so if you want to exploit a desktop system, there's tons of them out there. They've got lots of plugins. You're going to have to bypass like exploit mitigations. Maybe there's going to be a sandbox depending on the web browser. Like if you're in Chrome or something, there's going to be a sandbox. But then you're done. You get to be there forever. On the mobile device, it's harder because they're probably not going to be, the average person going to your website is going to be a desktop system, not a phone. There's a much smaller attack surface. Same thing, you're going to have bypasses. Then you're going to definitely have to escape a sandbox. Then you're going to have to basically turn off code signing or something, on iOS at least, to persist. On Android, you don't have to worry about that. So anyway, so it's obviously much harder to do exploitation on mobile devices than on desktops. But you might say, hey, Charlie, what about all the things that, there's more attack surface on mobile devices because you have things like, text messages that you don't have on a desktop. You have, baseband attacks, and you have, near-field communication. So there's lots of things that mobile devices have that PCs don't. And so maybe that makes up for it. And I say, no, that's not true. So like I had that, there's been like 2 SMS attacks I can think of. Never, always by researchers, never in real life. There's been a few baseband attacks. I don't think there's been any in real life for that either. In fact, there's only a couple researchers who really know how to do that. I'm not one of them. And then NFC, again, there's been maybe 2 or 3 exploits in real life. All right, 2 or 3 exploits, all written by researchers, not by actual people who are trying to attack you. So while there is more attack surface, again, we haven't seen attacks against it. So let's do some more digging into this to see whether I'm just full of shit or not. So you can't really read that, but this is a list of all the exploits that we've seen inside of this thing, this toolkit called Black Hole, which is something like black hats use frequently to exploit browsers. And so if you'll notice, these are all CVEs and things like PDF renders or Java or other kind of plugins. But the point is, none of these exploits that are in this well-known toolkit work against mobile devices. They're all for PCs. What about Mezploit? Well, Mezploit, with the exception of a couple things that work against like iPhone 1, there are no exploits for mobile devices. This very well-known Operation Aurora that happened a few years ago. That was an exploit against web browsers, but it wasn't against mobile devices. It was just web browsers. What other mobile exploits have there been? Well, I've done a few. There was one at a conference called RSA, like a year or 2 ago. Obviously, opponent owned, there's a lot of exploits. Jailbreakme.com, we already talked about. But that's it. Like, you don't see, there's really been no cases of malicious mobile exploits ever. So it's, to be worried about this is to be very paranoid, I think. And what about in real life, like real attacks that have happened? You guys might not know about these as much since they're all in the US that I know about. But like earlier this year, I think, New York Times got hacked. So Facebook got hacked and then a bunch of stuff got stolen. Apple got hacked. Microsoft got hacked, all in the same attack. And Twitter did too, but we're not talking about that. So these all got hacked, right? So how did the attacker get in? Did they attack their mobile devices? No, it wasn't mobile. It was just your standard. It was exploits against web browsers on desktops. So in real life, as far as I know, there's never been an attack that's been traced back to a mobile exploit. So why are we so worried, right? Is there something that actually, so I'm trying to tell you there's nothing really to worry about now. But are there some things we should be worried about? And I say, yeah, there's basically 2 problems. One is users are not so smart, and the other is Android fragmentation, which is like a pretty bad issue. So the biggest problem with users is not that they're going to visit a bad site or that they're going to download malware, which is the problem in desktop world. The problem on phones is that they're just going to lose their phone. So as long as you can stop them from doing that or protecting them with like pins, you're in pretty good shape. Also, users are going to do things like jailbreak their phones because they want to have, like Hello Kitty desktop or something. I'm listening to hear the translation of that. Anyway, I don't know if you guys even know what Hello Kitty is, but so what happens when you jailbreak your phone? Well, it basically turns off all the security. You think it's just turning off some little bit, but it turns off everything. It turns off a bunch of the mitigations. It obviously lets you download code from anywhere. That's what it's supposed to do. It also, the code you download no longer runs in a sandbox, and it might run as root. The code you download now can dynamically change itself, which it shouldn't be able to do. It adds more attack surface by adding more code, and it can actually break what little security software there is that's already there. So anyway, when the users jailbreak their phone, they're going to turn off all of their security. So again, this is more or less a user problem. This isn't Apple's fault that people do this. So yeah, so if you jailbreak your phone, you basically go back to desktop security or worse. So the biggest issue really in mobile, in my opinion, is this problem about fragmentation. And the problem is with Android, you don't just buy a phone and you're done, right? So you buy a phone, at least in the US, it's made by some company like Samsung, so they physically make the device. And then you get your carrier, like AT&T or whoever you guys have down here. They add software to it because they can. And then, of course, Google has provided you with tons of code in the operating system. So you've got these three parties involved. And anytime that there's a problem and they want to update it, all three parties have to be involved in that process. And the biggest problem with that is that two of the parties, the manufacturer and the carrier, they don't actually want you to upgrade. They want you to buy a new phone. So they're really not motivated to provide you an update. Google is the only one that actually has an interest in you updating your device. And so you have three people who have to get along. They don't like each other, and they don't actually want you to upgrade. And so that's why we don't see upgrades. iPhone is a different story. Apple controls everything. It's very easy to upgrade your phone. It can happen over the air, and people want to upgrade. So like here's some numbers that just show the case for fragmentation. So this is a graph you can get from Google. It shows the adoption of the new operating systems as they come out. So you can see that these lines, they don't go up very fast. So ice cream sandwich, which came out a long time ago, is still in this chart less than 50% of users. So here's some more numbers on Android and how slow it is to upgrade. So on the left is the date that the various versions came out. And on the right is the adoption of those versions. So you can see that, so 4.2 came out almost a year ago, but is only at 8% adoption. Likewise, like 4.0 came out 2 years ago, and that and newer is at like 50%. So 50% of phones are running Android are running a version more than 2 years old. In iOS, it's like a totally different story. So in iOS, people upgrade very quickly. So this is a graph I took 2 months ago, and so I'll give you iOS 7 numbers on the next slide. But here, so version 6 came out about a year ago, and 92% of users are on version 6 when this came out. That's a big difference. In iOS 7, so that obviously that just came out 2 weeks ago or something, and you can see that already like over 60% of users are on iOS 7. So in 2 weeks, you've got 60% of people already upgraded to the new version of iOS. So that's very different than in Android. And then, for the few pieces of malware that have involved exploits, so Gingerbreak was one that allowed you to get root, and so that affected up to 234 in Android. But it still affects somewhere between 2 and 33% of devices, even though this exploit is 2 years old. The exploit I talked about earlier, jailbreakme.com 3, it affects iOS up to 433. It came out around the same time, and it only affects 3% of devices. So you probably believe by now that that's a problem, and you probably believe, hopefully, that mobile devices, you don't have to worry too much about exploitation and malware at this point. But what are the things you can do to help protect your device? Say you really want to do that, like it's your job to do that. Like I said already, you can't change how secure the operating system is. That's not under your control. You can't change how hard it is to get them reviewed. You can't change the sandboxing. You can't change the ASLR and the depth. You can't change whether your devices have hardware encryption built in, anything like that. And you can't really even install antivirus on phones. Because of the whole sandboxing model, it just doesn't work. You just have to trust that the operating system is going to do things right for you. The few things you can do are things like enforce passcodes to help your users when they lose their phones. You can enforce things like encryption. You can use remote locate. On things like Android, you can limit where the apps can be downloaded from. But again, these things are things you can do, but users can still change. You know, they can get around these if they really want to. So who are we worried about? What are the attackers we care about? So you've got your teenagers and you know that are just trying to show off for their friends, and they're just doing it for fun. So in that case, what are they going to choose to do? Well, if you're a teenager and you just want to impress your friends by having a little botnet or something, you're not going to go after mobile because it's harder. You're going to concentrate on PCs. What if you're a cyber criminal? In that case, you're going to want to try to make money, and you want to do that easily and as quickly as possible. So again, you're gonna go after PCs because it's so much easier, and you've probably already got a bunch of code sitting around to do it. So really, if you're a smart criminal, you're not going to worry about mobile because it's harder. What if you're like the Chinese government or something, and you're going after the president of Brazil? Then it's certainly a possibility, right? They have a lot of money, and they have a very particular target they're going after. So in that case, they might go after mobile. But most people in this room probably aren't the target of a real EPT. So if that's the people you worry about, then you probably have a real fear to worry. But I'm not worried about that. So if you're someone who has to decide how to focus your energy or focus your money, what are you going to do about mobile? So I wouldn't completely ignore it, but it's probably not worth it to spend a lot of money on it because, like I said, you're not going to see attacks against it, and there's not really any evidence that there's ever been an attack against it that caused a problem for a company. So what might change in the future? So like maybe something's going to change, and 2 years down the road, mobile will be a problem. So what would have to change for that to happen? Like the mobile OSs aren't going to get any worse, right? You're not going to see like they're not going to remove ASLR. They're not going to remove sandboxing. But what might change though is that it might not get easier for mobile attacks, but it might get harder to do PC attacks. So like this OS X, they're having the App Store. There might be more. There's more sandboxing in browsers already. There might be less third-party plugins. And so while it's always going to be pretty hard to do mobile attacks, like and the desktop attacks are here, like eventually if desktop attacks get up to here, then it might be a fair game for everybody. Also, like the attackers that are trying to make money, they need to follow the data. So if all the data eventually ends up on your phone, then eventually the bad guys will have to go after your phone. But for now, that's not the case. So to wrap things up, I think we've all shown as researchers that mobile attacks are certainly possible. But in real life, we don't see them. And if there is going to be a mobile attack against a platform, it's probably going to be against Android because it's easier. You might see it as part of like a super sophisticated attack, but not just your normal kind of attack. Attackers aren't stupid; they'll do what's easiest for them to accomplish their goals. And right now, that's not mobile. And here's a bunch of slides, resources that sort of back up what I say, and that's it. Do you have any questions? Well, I'll be around. If you have questions, just come up to me and we can chat. Thanks.